The doorbell rang 23 minutes after I sent the message from my husband's phone. By then, David was standing at the bottom of our staircase with a towel around his neck, his hair still wet from the shower, and I was in the kitchen with one hand pressed against the counter because my knees had stopped trusting me. Neither of us moved. The bell rang again, and in that awful second I realized revenge had a sound. It sounded polite, ordinary, almost gentle. Like someone waiting on a front porch in a quiet Ohio neighborhood not knowing she had just walked into the wreckage of a marriage. 30 minutes earlier I had been rinsing 2 coffee mugs in the sink while the dishwasher hummed beside me. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, the kind of evening where the sky turns gray before supper, and every house on the block seems to glow from the inside. David had come home late again. He kissed my cheek without really looking at me, said he needed a shower and went upstairs. That had become our routine. At 35, I never thought I would already feel lonely inside my own marriage. We had no children yet, though not for lack of trying. We had a mortgage, 2 aging cars, a shared calendar, and the kind of quiet life people tell you to be grateful for. But lately, David had been somewhere else, even when he was sitting 3 feet from me. His phone was always face down. His answers were short. His work meetings stretched later and later. When I asked what was wrong, he said, "I'm just tired, Claire." Tired. That word can cover a lot of sins. I was wiping the counter when his phone lit up beside the fruit bowl. I did not mean to look, but the words appeared bright across the screen. Last night meant everything to me. Under it was a little red heart. No name I recognized, just the first initial G. My breath left me so fast I had to grab the edge of the island. Last night, David had told me he was helping a coworker with car trouble. He came home smelling like restaurant coffee and cold air, and when I reached for his hand in bed, he pretended to be asleep. I stared at that message until the screen went dark. Then I did something I am not proud of. I picked up his phone. His password was still our anniversary. The message thread was short, careful, almost too careful. So I typed the words before my common sense could catch up with my pain. "Come over, she's gone." Then I hit send. 23 minutes later, the doorbell rang, and David came down the stairs. The doorbell rang a third time. David looked toward the front window, then at me. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked. His voice sounded normal, almost casual, but I noticed how quickly the color drained from his face when he caught sight of his phone lying on the kitchen island. I couldn't answer. Every terrible possibility I had imagined during the last 23 minutes had suddenly become real enough to breathe. "I'll get it," I whispered. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. I had expected someone younger than me, someone glamorous, someone wearing expensive perfume and carrying the confidence of a woman who believed she had won. Instead, I found a woman who looked old enough to be my mother. She was probably 58 or 60 with neatly styled silver blonde hair tucked behind her ears. She wore a navy wool coat despite the mild weather and held a loaf of banana bread wrapped carefully in a blue kitchen towel. Her eyes were kind, nervous, almost frightened. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she offered a hesitant smile. "Claire," I frowned. "Yes. I'm Grace." She looked past me into the house before lowering her voice. I almost turned around twice on the drive over. That wasn't the entrance I'd expected from a mistress. She wasn't smiling triumphantly. She wasn't flirting. If anything, she looked like someone arriving at a funeral. I folded my arms. "You said last night meant everything to you." The words came out sharper than I intended. Grace blinked in confusion. Yes. "And you came because I told you I was gone." Her forehead creased. "I thought David sent that." Before I could answer, footsteps echoed behind me. David had reached the hallway. The moment he saw Grace standing on the porch, every muscle in his body froze. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The look on his face wasn't desire. It wasn't embarrassment. It was shock. Pure, unmistakable shock. "Grace," he breathed. She gave him a tiny, uncertain smile. "I wasn't sure you'd really want me here." David looked from her to me, then down at his phone still sitting on the kitchen island. His eyes met mine. "You answered my phone." "I did." Silence settled over the 3 of us. The kind that makes every clock in the house suddenly sound louder. Grace shifted the banana bread awkwardly from one hand to the other. "I think," she said softly, "I think I've walked into something I don't understand." I laughed once. It wasn't a happy laugh. "No," I said quietly. "You're exactly where I thought you belonged." Grace's expression crumpled. David closed his eyes for a second as though bracing for impact. Then he looked at me with a sadness I hadn't seen in months. "Claire," he said carefully, "before you say another word, Please let me explain who Grace is. I stared at both of them. Every instinct told me not to believe whatever came next. But something about Grace's trembling hands, something about the fear in David's face, didn't fit the story I had been telling myself. For a long moment no one moved. The banana bread was still in Grace's hands. David was standing 6 feet behind me, barefoot on the hardwood floor, his damp hair leaving tiny drops of water on his t-shirt. Finally, Grace looked at me and spoke so quietly I almost missed it. "I'm sorry." I frowned. "For what?" "For walking into your home like this." She glanced at David. "I never wanted our first meeting to happen this way." "Our first meeting?" I looked back at my husband. "David," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "who is she?" He swallowed hard. "She's my sister." The words hung in the air. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it sounded impossible. "You don't have a sister." "I do." "You've told me about your parents, your grandparents, your uncle in Kentucky. You've never once mentioned a sister." "I know. That's because she doesn't exist." Grace flinched, but she didn't argue. David rubbed both hands over his face before looking directly at me. "She exists, Claire. I just believed she was dead." Everything inside me stopped. Grace slowly stepped into the house after I moved aside without thinking. She placed the banana bread on the kitchen counter like someone unsure whether she belonged there. Then she began telling a story that sounded like it belonged in another lifetime. 33 years earlier, David's parents had gone through a vicious divorce. His father had kept David. His mother had left with Grace. The divorce became a war. Accusations. Court hearings. Restraining orders. Then both parents disappeared into different states, each determined to erase the other from their lives. David's father told him his mother had abandoned them. Later, when David asked about the little sister he barely remembered, his father quietly said they had both died in a car accident. Grace grew up hearing the opposite. Her mother insisted David had chosen to stay with his father and wanted nothing to do with them. Whenever Grace asked to find her brother, her mother shut the conversation down. Years became decades. Both children built entire lives around lies they never knew were lies. 2 months ago, Grace took one of those mail-order DNA genealogy tests after her own daughter bought it as a birthday gift. A few weeks later, she received an unexpected match. A half-brother, David. She reached out through the genealogy website. At first, he thought it had to be a mistake. Then came old birth certificates, photographs, court records. The truth slowly unfolded. Last night, Grace said her eyes filling with tears was the first time we'd ever shared a meal together as adults. She looked down at her hands. We talked for 4 hours, then she smiled sadly. When I texted him this morning and said, "Last night meant everything to me," I meant, I finally found my brother. I felt every ounce of anger drain out of my body, replaced by something much heavier. Shame. I looked at David. I know what you thought. I answered your phone. I know. I invited her here. Grace gave me a gentle smile that somehow made me feel even worse. "If our situations had been reversed," she said softly, "I might have done exactly the same thing. I wanted to apologize. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I noticed something that hadn't made sense before." David still looked troubled. Relieved, yes, but not relieved enough. The secret about Grace had been exposed. Yet something behind his eyes was still weighing him down. And suddenly I realized the affair I had imagined was gone. But the mystery wasn't. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt unsteady. The story about Grace explained the text message, but it didn't explain the last 6 months of my marriage. It didn't explain why David had pulled away from me. It didn't explain the late nights, the whispered phone calls, the unopened conversations that always ended with, "I'm just tired." Grace sensed the shift before either of us spoke. "I think I should go," she said gently. David shook his head. "No, please stay." She looked from him to me. "I don't want to make things worse." I took a slow breath. "This isn't your fault." For the first time that evening, I meant every word I said. Grace wasn't the woman who had come between my husband and me. She was someone who had spent 30 years believing she'd lost her only brother. None of this belonged to her. She quietly sat at our kitchen table while David and I remained standing. I folded my arms. "If this wasn't what you've been hiding," I said carefully, "then what have you been hiding?" David looked at the floor. The silence stretched long enough that I thought he might refuse to answer. Finally, he pulled out a chair and sat down. "I should have told you months ago." "Then tell me now." He nodded slowly. "It started after Grace found me." I frowned. "I thought you said that was only 2 months ago." "It was, but everything else started before that." He leaned forward, rubbing his hands together. My dad was diagnosed with advanced dementia last spring. The words landed with a dull weight. I had known his father had become forgetful, but David had always brushed it off. He told me it was normal aging, David continued. I believed him until the sheriff's department called me one afternoon. My stomach tightened. They found him wandering along Interstate 71. Grace quietly wiped away a tear. David looked toward her before continuing. He'd driven 40 miles without remembering where he lived. I lowered myself into the chair across from him. You never told me. I didn't know how. He gave a tired smile that never reached his eyes. The neurologist confirmed it 2 weeks later. He paused. After Grace and I reunited, we learned Dad had almost nothing left. What do you mean? He'd been paying for in-home care medications, legal fees, and making terrible financial decisions because of the disease. Grace spoke softly. We've been trying to keep him out of a nursing home for as long as possible. David nodded. I've been helping pay the bills. I stared at him. How much? He hesitated. Almost $30,000. The number hit me harder than I expected. Not because of the money itself, because we'd always promised each other there would be no financial secrets. No wonder you've been working overtime, I whispered. It wasn't enough. So the meetings were with attorneys. And the phone calls, doctors, social workers, insurance companies. Every answer untangled another knot, yet another one tightened. You trusted strangers with all of this, I said quietly. Lawyers, bankers, doctors. I looked him straight in the eyes. But you didn't trust your wife. David's shoulders slumped. I wasn't trying to keep you out. Then what were you doing? His voice cracked. I was trying to protect you. I shook my head. No, David. A tear slipped down my cheek. You were protecting yourself from having to let me help. Neither of us spoke after that. The silence between us no longer felt like suspicion. It felt like the beginning of a truth that had been waiting far too long to be told. No one spoke for nearly a minute. The kitchen clock ticked above the refrigerator, and somewhere outside a dog barked twice before everything went quiet again. Grace stood first. I'll leave you two alone, she said softly. You've both had enough surprises for one night. She squeezed David's shoulder, then turned to me. I'm glad we finally met Claire. There was no bitterness in her voice, only kindness. That somehow made me feel even worse about the way I'd greeted her. After she left, David walked her to the front porch. I watched through the window as they hugged awkwardly like two people trying to make up for 30 years in 30 seconds. When he came back inside, neither of us pretended everything was fine. He sat across from me at the kitchen table. I deserve whatever you're feeling, he said. I folded my hands together. No. He looked surprised. You deserve honesty. He waited. So do I. The words hung between us. I spent the last 6 months believing you didn't want me anymore. I admitted. Every time you turned away in bed, every time you said you were working late, every time you picked up your phone and walked into another room, I looked down at the table. I kept asking myself what I'd done wrong. You didn't do anything wrong, but you let me believe I had. He closed his eyes. I know. I wondered if you regretted marrying me. His head snapped up. Never. I wondered if you were in love with someone else. I wasn't. I wondered if we were becoming strangers. He didn't answer. Because that one was true. I thought if I carried everything myself, he said quietly, I could spare you the stress. I gave him a tired smile. Do you know what carrying everything by yourself actually did? He shook his head. It made me carry something even heavier. He frowned. What? The belief that I wasn't your partner anymore. That landed harder than anything else I'd said. He rubbed both hands over his face. I didn't see it that way. I know. I honestly believed I was protecting you. You weren't protecting me. I reached across the table and gently laid my hand over his. You were shutting me out. His fingers tightened around mine. I didn't know how to let you watch my father disappear. You didn't have to know. He looked at me through tear-filled eyes. We could have figured it out together. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, he cried. Not loudly. Just quietly. Like a man who had been holding his breath for months. When he finally spoke again, his voice barely rose above a whisper. I'm scared, Claire. I know. I'm losing my father. I know. I found a sister. I know. I almost lost my wife tonight. I squeezed his hand. You almost did. Neither of us pretended that one conversation could repair months of distance. Trust doesn't return because someone tells the truth once. It returns because they keep telling it. Before we went upstairs that night, I looked at David and made one request. I think we need help. He nodded almost immediately. Marriage counseling. Yes. No more secrets. No more silence. As we turned off the kitchen lights, I realized something that surprised me. The deepest wound in our marriage hadn't been betrayal. It had been loneliness. 2 weeks later, I met Grace for coffee. If you had told me a month earlier that I'd willingly spend an afternoon with the woman I had mistaken for my husband's mistress, I would have laughed in your face. Instead, there we were sitting in a quiet diner just outside Columbus sharing a slice of apple pie neither of us really needed. Grace smiled. I've been wanting to thank you. For what? For giving David another chance. I looked down at my coffee. I haven't decided how many chances he's getting. She laughed softly. Fair enough. There was something comforting about her. She didn't rush conversations. She listened more than she spoke, the way people often do after they've lived through enough disappointments to know silence has value. Over the next hour, she filled in pieces of David's childhood I had never heard. He used to collect baseball cards. He cried when their old Labrador died. He loved pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. As she spoke, I realized something that made my chest ache. She wasn't remembering a lifetime with her brother. She was remembering fragments from before she was 6 years old. Everything after that had been stolen. The following Saturday, David asked if I wanted to visit his father. I understand if you're not ready. I surprised both of us. I'll go. The assisted living facility sat on the edge of a small town about 45 minutes away. It was clean, quiet. The halls smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. When we walked into his father's room, an elderly man sat by the window staring at birds gathered around a feeder. He looked up. For one hopeful second, recognition filled his face. Dad, David said gently. The old man smiled. You're home from school already. David froze. He was 59 years old. His father believed he was 12. My heart broke before anyone spoke another word. A nurse quietly explained that some days were better than others. Today wasn't one of them. For the next hour, I watched David patiently answer the same questions again and again. What grade are you in? Did your mother pack your lunch? Is your little sister behaving herself? Every mention of Grace caught my attention. Even inside a mind clouded by dementia, some memory of her remained. When Grace arrived later that afternoon, their father looked at her with puzzled eyes. You live next door, don't you? She smiled through tears. Something like that. She didn't correct him. She simply sat beside him and held his hand. On the drive home, none of us spoke for miles. Finally, David broke the silence. I kept all of this from you because I thought it would crush you. I reached across the center console and rested my hand on his arm. It is crushing. He glanced at me. But now you're not carrying it alone. That evening, as I folded laundry in our bedroom, I realized something had quietly changed. I was no longer trying to uncover my husband's secret. I was helping him survive it. And somehow that felt far more important than proving I had been right. By early December, our Saturdays had settled into a rhythm. We visited David's father every weekend. Some days he recognized David's smile but not his name. Other days he insisted he had to leave for work even though he had retired more than 20 years earlier. Grace came whenever she could. Slowly, the awkwardness between us disappeared. One snowy afternoon, the administrator asked if we would take home several boxes of old family papers that had been sitting in storage. There's no reason to keep them here, she said. You may find things worth saving. David loaded the boxes into the trunk without much interest. I doubt there's anything important. He couldn't have been more wrong. The following Sunday, the three of us spread everything across our dining room table. There were faded photographs, tax returns, church bulletins, Christmas cards, a broken pocket watch. Hours passed before Grace opened a weathered shoebox tucked beneath a stack of old insurance files. Inside were dozens of unopened envelopes. Every one of them was addressed to David. The handwriting was neat and unmistakably feminine. Grace stared at the first envelope. My mother's handwriting. David frowned. The postmark says 1997. She picked up another. 1999. Another. 2003. My heart began to pound. None of the envelopes had ever been opened. David carefully slid a letter from the oldest one. The paper had yellowed with age. He read silently for nearly a minute before lowering it. His hands were trembling. What is it? I asked. His voice barely worked. She wrote, every birthday. Grace covered her mouth. No. David handed me the letter. It was simple. A mother writing to her son she desperately hoped would someday read her words. She told him Grace had started piano lessons. She enclosed a school picture. She wrote that she prayed for him every night. At the bottom, one sentence nearly stopped my heart. I keep sending these letters hoping your father will finally let you know we never stopped loving you." Silence swallowed the room. Grace reached for another envelope. Inside was another letter, then another. Every birthday, every Christmas, every graduation, every major milestone, year after year. None of them had reached David. He looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. "I thought," he whispered. His voice broke. "I thought she never tried." Grace was crying openly now. "My mother told me she mailed everyone." David slowly sank into his chair. She was telling the truth. I looked toward the remaining stack. There had to be 40 letters, maybe more. An entire lifetime of love had been sealed inside paper envelopes and hidden away. David suddenly stood. He lied. No one answered. "My father lied to me for 30 years. His breathing became uneven. He told me they forgot me." Grace shook her head through tears. "They never did." For the first time since I had known him, I saw anger replace David's quiet sadness. Not loud anger. Not violent anger. The kind that comes from discovering your entire childhood had been built on a lie. He looked toward the window where snow drifted quietly across our backyard. "I don't even know who my father really was anymore." I walked over and slipped my hand into his. "You know one thing." He looked at me. "You know your mother never stopped reaching for you." Christmas came and went quietly. For the first time since I had known David, the holidays weren't filled with cheerful traditions or carefully planned dinners. Instead, they were filled with questions no one could answer. Why had his father hidden the letters? Why had he let 2 children grow up believing they had been abandoned? David carried those questions with him every day. Still, every Saturday morning we drove to the assisted living center. Not because we expected answers, because he was still David's father. One cold afternoon in January, something changed. When we entered his room, the nurse met us at the door. "He's having a very clear day," she whispered. "If there's anything you've been wanting to ask him, today may be your chance." David and Grace exchanged a nervous glance. Neither moved at first. Finally, David pulled one of the old letters from his coat pocket. He had been carrying it for weeks. He placed it gently on the blanket covering his father's legs. The old man adjusted his glasses. He stared at the envelope for several seconds. Then he looked up. "I remember those." David's voice was calm, but I could hear it trembling underneath. "You remember keeping them?" His father nodded slowly. "I do." Grace swallowed hard. "Why?" The room became painfully quiet. Outside the window, snowflakes drifted across the parking lot. His father closed his eyes. "When your mother left?" He paused, searching for words. "I believed she had stolen everything." His breathing grew heavier. "I wasn't going to let her take my son, too." David stared at him. "So you told me they were dead." A long silence, then a tiny nod. "I thought," his father whispered, "if you stopped waiting, you'd stop hurting." Grace wiped away another tear. "And me?" He turned toward her. "I told your mother the same thing." She lowered her head. "You stole our childhood." His eyes filled with regret. "I know." "You stole 30 years." "I know." "You stole our family." The old man's shoulders sagged. "I was angry." He looked at both of them. "I stayed angry too long." No one raised their voice. No one accused him further. There was nothing left to win. Only pain to acknowledge. After several minutes, his father quietly said the words David had waited his entire life to hear. "I'm sorry." The apology couldn't return birthdays. It couldn't restore graduations, weddings, or decades of missed conversations. But it was real. David looked at Grace. She nodded almost imperceptibly. Neither of them said, "I forgive you," because neither was ready. Instead, David reached out and gently adjusted the blanket around his father's legs. It was such a small gesture, yet it spoke louder than words. Compassion wasn't the same as forgetting. Mercy wasn't the same as pretending nothing had happened. On the drive home, David finally broke the silence. "If you hadn't sent that text?" He glanced at me. "Grace might never have come to the house." I smiled sadly. "I've spent weeks wishing I could take that message back." He reached over and squeezed my hand. Maybe neither of us needed to. For the first time, I understood what he meant. The worst decision I'd ever made had also opened a door none of us would have opened otherwise. Spring arrived slowly that year. The snow melted into muddy lawns. The trees outside our neighborhood finally turned green again, and somewhere along the way our house stopped feeling so quiet. Not because our problems had disappeared, because we had stopped facing them alone. Every Thursday evening, David and I sat in the same marriage counselor's office. At first, the sessions felt awkward. We talked around our feelings instead of through them. I'd say I was hurt. He'd say he was overwhelmed. The counselor would gently ask, "What are you afraid to tell each other?" That question changed everything. Week after week, we stopped talking about text messages and hidden bank accounts. We started talking about fear. David admitted he had been terrified of looking weak in front of me. He had grown up believing a husband was supposed to solve every problem by himself. Asking for help felt like failure. I admitted something of my own. When your phone lit up that night, I told him I wasn't just afraid you were cheating. He looked at me. I was afraid I wasn't enough anymore. He reached across the space between us. "You've always been enough." "No," I said gently. "You believe that now. But back then, your silence told a different story." He nodded. "I know." Grace became part of our lives in ways neither of us expected. Sunday dinners rotated between our homes. She teased David about the baseball cards he'd refused to throw away. He teased her about the terrible coffee she somehow managed to make every single time. Sometimes I'd sit back and simply watch them. A brother and sister learning each other's habits in their late 50s, trying to make up for birthdays they had never shared. It was beautiful and heartbreaking. David's father declined steadily. By early May, he no longer recognized any of us. There were no more clear days, no more conversations, only quiet visits where David held his father's hand while old country songs played softly from a radio near the window. One evening after we returned home from the facility, David stood in the kitchen where everything had begun months earlier. He looked at the fruit bowl. Then, at the spot where his phone had been lying that October evening. "It's strange," he said. "What is?" "I used to think that message almost ruined my life." I walked over beside him. "And now," he smiled sadly, "I think my silence almost did." I leaned my head against his shoulder. "I almost destroyed us with one impulsive text. And I almost destroyed us with 6 months of secrets." Neither statement canceled the other. Both were true. Marriage, I had learned, rarely falls apart because of one dramatic moment. It slowly cracks wherever honesty disappears. As we stood together in our quiet kitchen, I realized something that would have sounded impossible months earlier. The night I believed I had caught my husband betraying me was actually the night we finally stopped betraying each other. A year has passed since the night I answered my husband's phone. Sometimes I still think about that moment. Not because I'm proud of it, but because it reminds me how quickly fear can write a story before the truth has a chance to speak. David's father passed away peacefully that autumn. Grace was holding one of his hands. David was holding the other. When the nurse quietly closed the door behind us, no one said much. There wasn't anything left to say. The years that had been stolen could never be returned. But the months they did have together had mattered, more than any of us had expected. A few weeks after the funeral, David suggested we host Thanksgiving. "Are you sure?" I asked. He smiled. "I think it's time this house holds happier memories." So we did. Grace brought her famous banana bread. This time when the doorbell rang, I laughed before I answered it. She stood on the porch holding the same blue kitchen towel wrapped around the warm loaf. "I figured I'd keep the tradition," she said with a grin. I hugged her before she could step inside. "You don't have to ring the bell anymore," I told her. "Your family." She smiled, and for just a second I imagined the little girl she'd once been, the one who spent decades believing her brother had forgotten her. Inside, David was setting the table. He caught my eye and smiled. It wasn't the smile of a man carrying unbearable secrets anymore. It was the smile of someone who had finally learned that love grows stronger when it's shared instead of protected. After dinner, while everyone else cleared the dishes, I wandered into the kitchen. The fruit bowl still sat on the island, almost exactly where David's phone had lit up that October evening. I rested my hand on the counter and shook my head. One message, one impulsive reply, one knock at the door. That was all it took to change the course of 3 lives. People sometimes ask whether I regret sending that text. The honest answer is complicated. Yes, because it came from pain instead of trust. Because I judged someone innocent before asking a single question. But no, because that unexpected knock forced hidden truths into the open. It ended months of silence. It reunited a broken family. And it reminded my husband and me that marriage isn't protected by pretending everything is fine. It's protected by telling the truth before fear fills in the blanks. If there's one lesson I carry with me now, it's this. The greatest threat to a marriage isn't always another person. Sometimes it's 2 good people quietly suffering alone because they believe love means carrying every burden by themselves. If you've ever been tempted to assume the worst, I hope you'll pause long enough to ask one more question. If you've ever been the one hiding your pain, I hope you'll remember that the people who love you can't help carry what they never know exists. Thank you for spending this journey with me. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone you love, please consider sharing it with them. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about family forgiveness and second chances, I'd be honored if you subscribed and joined me again.